cut. Happy to have Jeannie Dixon here from the Department of Earth Sciences, one of our recent hires on the EPSCoR. Jeannie is a geomorphologist, as you all know, and she looks at the chemical, physical, and biological processes that shape landscapes, and she asks big questions like, does weathering shape the land surface? And the thing I like about Jeannie's work is she works at global scales, so she's looked at global rates of weathering and silica erosion, but she also works at local landscapes, so she's worked in the Alps, in California, and now in Montana, so that's great. She got her bachelor's at Carleton College and then her PhD at Dartmouth, so we're glad to have you here. Thanks.
Thank you, Kathy. Thank you, guys. I'm really excited to have such a turnout and excited to present my work. I consider myself an interdisciplinary scientist, but often for that it means that I'm a geomorphologist, maybe working with a soil scientist or working with a biogeochemist. So pretty small interdisciplinary circle, and one of the great things about IOE is really expanding this and expanding the impact of some of the questions that I love to ask. I'll get to the title in a minute. One of the questions that I really love to address, and this is in my pretty short career, the theme, is the role that climate plays in shaping our land surface. And most of the ways I address this are in terms of feedbacks between chemical weathering and physical erosion. Chemical weathering being the processes that dissolve rock, form soil, alter minerals, and remove mass in solution, eventually out through rivers. And then physical erosion being the disintegration of rock and that physical movement of material off the surface. And those tend to actually be really important processes biologically, chemically, and physically on the landscape. I will be presenting and mostly focusing my presentation today on some work that I've been doing in collaboration with UCSB and Stanford scientists, Oliver Chadwick and Peter Vatusik, on chemical weathering effects from climate in New Zealand. We're looking at a beautiful picture of Mount Cook in the Waitaki Valley of the South Island of New Zealand in this frame. But I'm also going to be arcing through some work across my career, from my dissertation at Dartmouth to postdocs at Arizona State and the Geoforschungszentrum in Potsdam, Germany, and then UCSB too. And I'm continuing this work now. Okay. So, why do we love soil? And I know Tony Hartshorn in the back has probably already ramped you up about why you should care so much about soil if you didn't already. But why is she so excited? Why is she smiling in a way that you guys necessarily aren't yet? What does she know? Well, she's probably most excited by the fact that chemical weathering is altering these soils. Let's pretend for a minute. She will. In 20 years, I promise you. So what does she know about chemical weathering that you don't, or maybe you do? She knows that chemical weathering of bedrock alters these primary minerals, dissolves some minerals away, forms new minerals, and in that alteration and dissolution of minerals, we sculpt land surfaces. So chemical weathering is this somewhat underappreciated component of landscape evolution, and maybe removes up to 50 or even 80% of the mass in upland landscapes, and maybe up to 20% of the mass in this landscape. So this rock, you see that it's probably eroding away, but what you don't really see is the dissolution, because it already happened. And so it's this important component of landscape evolution. The chemical processes feed back on physical processes that shape the land surface we see. But then also these nutrients that are released by chemical processes help to form the soils and are eventually moved out of this soil ecosystem into the rivers and streams. And so we get cascading effects from the chemical weathering at this micro scale. And what are these? Well, chemical weathering helps to shape soil, which forms our habitable substrate for life and for many other ecosystems. There might be many other organisms that beam when they think about chemical weathering because it shapes their substrate and where they live. these nutrients that are essential for both animal, plants, microbes, cascade through the ecosystem and replenish floodplains and become the nutrients that all biota essentially uses, these rock-derived nutrients, which may make some other organisms smile, and then eventually you smile. So cascading effects, and we rely on the services from chemical weathering in a lot of ways, in shaping our soils and providing healthy ecosystems, and also in order to produce the other things that make us smile, like wine, beer, and chocolate. Why not? Okay. Another reason we might care about chemical weathering is that silicate weathering at Earth's surface draws down carbon dioxide. And over geologic timescales, this is invoked as one of the major drivers of atmospheric CO2. And it's the foundation of a number of hypotheses that really motivate a lot of work in landscapes like this, in the Southern Alps, in mountainous landscapes. One hypothesis is that chemical weathering and carbon dioxide levels feed back to maintain stable temperatures at Earth's surface. CO2 is sometimes called the thermostat, where you can imagine if there's some forcing that causes a warmer climate, that warmer climate, increased temperature, perhaps increased precipitation, would mean increased chemical weathering. If you have increased chemical weathering, you have increased CO2 drawdown. Increased CO2 drawdown leads to a cooler climate, and we basically have this negative feedback that's maintaining stable temperatures. So implicit in this hypothesis is that chemical weathering and climate are really strongly linked. Another major hypothesis for at least geological studies is that global uplift could maybe drive global cooling. So if we have uplift of this mountain range, we enhance physical erosion, we enhance chemical weathering, we draw down CO2, and we lead to global cooling. And so also implicit in this assumption is that there's some relationship between chemical weathering and climate. Okay, so you can kind of see where I'm going with this climate weathering relationship, and that brings me to my title here, Climate's Elusive Control on Soil Development. And I'll tell you that when I make this talk, I'm really uncertain whether I should say illusive or elusive. And I want to make the distinction here because something that is elusive with an I is an illusion. It doesn't really exist. We look for it, we think it's there, but it's not as important as we think it is. Something that's elusive with an E eludes us. It's there, but we haven't quite been able to grasp the nature of that phantasm, right? We know it's important, but maybe we don't yet have the quantitative tools or the right landscapes or the right isolation of other factors to figure it out. And as a sort of peek forward towards the end of the lecture, I'm actually going to suggest that this is an elusive relationship with an E. It's not an illusion, but it might be in some landscapes. And that'll become clearer towards the end. So to even suggest that it's elusive or elusive is a bit controversial because we've known for about 100 years that climate is one of the most fundamental controls on soil formation and landscapes. Going back to Hans Jenne, this fabulous soil scientist, it's one of his 5 factors of soil formation, right? Climate, organisms, parent material, time, relief, clorped. And so climate is one of these fundamental controls on soil properties. Inherent in that is that climate is controlling chemical weathering processes that shape soils. Also, if you open up any textbook for geomorphology, and I'm guessing this is in a lot of intro earth science textbooks, you'll see a figure like this. We're looking at mean annual temperature on the y-axis, mean annual precipitation on the x-axis, and a bunch of different weathering regimes within that. So warm and wet means strong chemical weathering. Cold and dry means strong physical weathering. And this conceptually makes sense, right? I mean, you can't really question this. That makes sense. We know that weathering rates and extent should be influenced by temperature and moisture. If you have warmer temperatures, you're controlling the kinetics of chemical reactions. It's why sugar dissolves faster in hot tea than cold tea, right? Despite Southerners' best intentions. So temperature is important because it controls the rates of chemical reactions. Water plays a role in almost every single chemical reaction that weathers rock, that forms soil. And so moisture and temperature are essential, and therefore warm and wet should mean strong chemicals. And we could occupy this plot here with a bunch of different landscapes that kind of fit this chemical weathering regime, where physical weathering might dominate or chemical weathering might dominate. For example, in the highlands of Sri Lanka, one landscape I work in, we have intense weathering, completely chemically depleted soils, thick regolith, warm and wet means really intense chemical weathering. Others have gone to the Antarctic dry valleys, where we have thin regolith profiles, minimal but still important chemical weathering processes. And we can pop up a bunch of different landscapes and soils from the Sierra Nevada to the Alps. And what I want to ask, though, is what does this figure really tell us about the evolution of a landscape? What do these regimes mean for that girl in the first plot who was so excited about chemical weathering or so excited about soils that she plays in? Does it tell us how chemically altered the system is? Does it tell us what nutrients are available to ecosystems? Does it tell us how rapidly eroded this landscape is? And the truth is it might inform some of those, but it probably doesn't directly relate to any of them. Because what if I go to warm and wet in Taiwan versus warm and wet in Sri Lanka? The soils are going to be completely decoupled from the climate depending on what the erosion or tectonic regime is. And so geology becomes really important in this. And the fact that Earth's surface is an incredibly dynamic place, and that there are few landscapes that operate in this vacuum becomes important when we start to think about how soils are actually controlled by climate across Earth's dynamic surface. Okay. So there's some other reasons that we think temperature and moisture should be important, not just from these conceptual ideas. There are laboratory experiments that show strong relationships between temperature and chemical reaction rates. And so we're looking at some experiments from Art White, where he basically had this reactor. He was weathering different types of granite, looking at the solutes that came out of it. And he found that basically the amount of silicon and the amount of sodium that came out of these rocks was dependent on the temperature of that environment. And for those of you who can really see these axes, I'll apologize because this is actually log silicon versus -1 temperature. So if you're really, really eyeing in on these axes, all you really need to know is that increases in these weathering constituents and increases in temperature on the x-axis. So we have laboratory, we have first principle, we have conceptual reasons that we know temperature should control chemical reaction rates. And this can be described by Arrhenius-Sauer relationship, where this sort of reaction rate constant is dependent on the temperature in which this reaction occurs. Now we can also go to large rivers, to the streams that are transporting these weathered products, and we can measure the amount of weathering that comes out of them. And so here, this is also Art White's work. He's gone to a bunch of global rivers and measured the silica flux, how much silicon is coming out of this system, and the average temperature of these environments. And once again, in this field data, we find a strong relationship between the amount of weathering and the temperature. So confirming what we expect conceptually and what we find in laboratory experiments. We can also go to these rivers and compare that silicon flux to runoff or moisture, how much moisture is moving through this area. And we find that these weathering products increase with rainfall. So that also conceptually makes sense. And so this is silicon flux on the y-axis and runoff and precipitation on the x-axis. So increases, and then there's a log inset plot inside. Okay, so we have real reasons to see from the geochemistry of large rivers, from laboratory experiments, that climate matters. It makes sense to us conceptually. What happens when we go to soils? Because soils are where these solutes are actually being derived from. The weathering reactions that transform bedrock to soil are releasing the elements that are transported by rivers. So you think that if we see this relationship in laboratory experiments and we see it in rivers, then we should see it in the soils, right? And there's one issue, and that's that soils are a completely different beast. While solutes give us instantaneous weathering fluxes, soils are integrating over really long time scales, right? So how long does it take to form this soil, and over what time scale is that soil responding to climate? I'm going to take a quick step back and give you sort of a conceptual model for how a geomorphologist approaches a landscape and approaches a soil, because it actually tends to be a good bit distinct from the way a pedologist or a soil scientist might. And that's what I start with, a conceptual model kind of like this for an eroding landscape. I have an altered zone. You can see it in the Sri Lanka profile on the left-hand side of the screen. This unconsolidated material that's atop coherent bedrock, I'm going to call regolith. Just a universal term for this stuff that can be moved. Geomorphologists then tend to separate this regolith into the stuff that's actually physically mobile, the stuff that's mixed and moving down slope, and the stuff that's just chemically altered. And so here I'm going to co-opt the term soil from our soil scientists, and I'm going to use the term soil to solely apply to this physically mobile layer. Conceptually shown on the right-hand slide is that upper layer, and on the left you can see it sort of delineated by this actively rooted zone, bioturbated. It's physically mobile. It's chemically altered, and it's physically mobile. Underlying that soil is kind of a rotten rock, right? It's chemically altered, but it isn't physically mobile in the same sense that the stuff moving down the slope is. And so I'm going to use a general term, saprolite, to describe all of that. And what's important here is that you have chemical weathering occurring both within the saprolite and in the soil, but you only have physical erosion of that uppermost layer, of the soil layer. And so each of these terms on the right-hand side of that right-hand graph are describing mass transfer. Rock is produced into regolith by chemical weathering processes. That saprolite is physically incorporated into a mobile soil column as soil production. We have mass lost from this system by chemical weathering, shown with our W's. We have mass lost by the system physically as soil is transported and mixed downslope. That's our E term. And then we could collectively call all of these losses denudation. Now, what's important for this system from a geomorphologist perspective is that weathering doesn't just occur at the surface and slowly make its way to depth. Instead, we need to think about the evolution of minerals in this layer, both as they're weathering top down, but also as they're basically being exhumed by erosion processes. So if you take the perspective of a chunk of rock or a mineral at depth, and I don't know if you can quite see it, I've just put up this small blue polygon here to show that. From the perspective of this mineral, what's happening is the rest of the land surface is lowering away as it's being exhumed. And so that's important here. There could be some steady state to this landscape where the picture that you get today could be the same picture you get in 100,000 years. It's just that those layers and those soil horizons have migrated down with that dynamic surface. Now, so as this chunk of mineral is exhumed and everything else is eroding away from above it, that gives us an idea of the time scale over which we need to integrate. That soil is integrating over the entire time that that mineral spent within the window, right?
How big is this piece of rock? Is it a baseball or a crystal?
Let's call it a quartz crystal. It doesn't even really matter. And so we need a tool that integrates over that time scale. And we've been really lucky with some advents in cosmogenic nuclide techniques, so including beryllium-10, that give us a window into soil and landscape evolution over millennial timescales, over these 1,000-year timescales in which soils are formed, maintained, and eroded. And so these were these cosmogenic nuclides. They were called cosmogenic nuclides, formed from cosmic rays, because all we really knew is that Earth was being bombarded by this ray, this stuff from the cosmos. Now we know that in the shock wave supernovas, we have high-energy protons and neutrons flying across the galaxy, being modulated by Earth's magnetic field and constantly bombarding the atmosphere and the surface. And so imagine an oxygen atom really anywhere on Earth, either in the atmosphere or locked within a mineral grain at the surface. When that oxygen atom is bombarded by one of these high-energy protons or cosmic rays, it essentially breaks apart. And beryllium-10 is formed by this spallation. And this is the only way that this beryllium-10 atom is formed, by this cosmogenic bombardment. So the stuff that's produced in the atmosphere, you have an oxygen atom that suddenly is turned into a beryllium atom. That beryllium atom finds itself incredibly high. It just falls down to the surface. But these ones that are produced in mineral grains at surface are really valuable because they're locked within that environment that is being slowly exhumed. And so as that mineral is being exhumed from depth, it's accumulating these cosmic rays. It's accumulating these cosmogenic nuclides. And so we can use the concentration of these in situ produced beryllium-10 atoms, basically count them, to find out how long that surface was exposed. So imagine this same mineral grain at depth. Let's fix our frame of reference here so that instead we're standing at the surface and we're watching this mineral grain be exhumed through the column of material. And so this is what happens. As that quartz mineral is exhumed from depth, it's accumulating beryllium-10. And so we can imagine that if we have slow erosion, we have more beryllium-10. But now imagine that same rock within a more dynamic geomorphic or erosional landscape. Erosion is faster, therefore it's essentially exhumed faster. We end up getting less beryllium-10 that reflects this higher erosion rate. So conceptually pretty simple. Now the question is, what does that exhumation rate actually mean? That exhumation rate is actually telling us the rate at which the overlying mass was removed. And so that's occurring both chemically and physically. And so here, we can assume that this cosmogenic derived rate is actually giving us the denudation rate, D, shown on the screen here, which we need to separate into the physical and chemical components. And we can do that using elemental mass balance. So imagine a rock rich in calcium. When that rock is weathered, we might have one starting concentration, and we end up with less. We end up with a lower concentration of that mobile element. Now we could take the perspective of an immobile element, something like zirconium, which is locked in the mineral zircon, incredibly chemically inert. And at the same time that these other mobile elements are being removed away, this zirconium becomes enriched because it's physically retained in the material, but we have mass being lost from it. So zirconium has this relative enrichment in soil compared to rock. And we can use that relative enrichment to tell us something about the percent of mass that's lost by chemical weathering. And I'm going to call this the CDF. And I promise I'm not going to put up many more equations. So those of you who are already glazing over, it's okay. What's important here is that we can actually calculate the chemical weathering rate using this enrichment of our immobile element and that cosmogenically derived denudation rate. So now what we've done is we've measured a denudation rate, we've measured a couple elements in rock and soil, and we actually now know the physical erosion rate and the chemical weathering rate. And none of this is new. It's been co-opted by soil scientists who've been doing it for decades and even longer. We could even think about the relative loss of individual elements, thinking about the relative ratios of this mobile element, those stars in blue, and that immobile element, those stars in yellow. And this is a tau. Okay, so what's cool here is we now have a method to not only think about that exhumation rate, but to actually think about the chemical weathering rates and the physical erosion rates that are dynamically changing this landscape and shaping the soils in it. And so for my first work thinking about the role of climate, we're now returning to climate, I use these techniques in the Sierra Nevada of California along a climate gradient. And so we're standing outside Fresno, we're looking up at the Sierran crest to the east of us, and you can imagine that we have this strong gradient and changes in moisture availability and precipitation and in temperature. And so what I did is across this gradient measure a bunch of cosmogenic rates and these immobile elements in soil and rock. And we're looking at landscape averages, so each of these are averaging about maybe 10 data points for each one of these study sites. And so we're looking at the measured weathering rate on the y-axis versus the elevation on the x-axis. Okay, but what does this mean for climate, right? Because we have temperature varying one way. We have warm temperatures at low elevation. Okay, that should mean more weathering. Oh, but we have more moisture at high elevation. That should mean more weathering. So we have these competing effects of climate influencing the landscape. So how do you disentangle what kind of looks like some weird humped or something relationship between weathering rate and elevation with predicted relationships from laboratory experiments between temperature and weathering and moisture availability and weathering? And so we used this equation that was derived from that white data I showed you earlier, where both temperature and precipitation are influencing the flux of these elements. The exact form of that equation doesn't really matter as long as you can see that there's a T in it and there's a P in it. I got it. And so from this model alone, not tweaking anything, using White's original parameters, what we would predict across this climate gradient where we have competing effects of temperature and precipitation is a humped relationship such that we are water limited in these environments where we're warm at low elevation, and we're temperature limited at high elevation. And high elevation might have an added effect of being somewhat moisture limited because most of the precip is delivered as snow and we have rapid runoff in the spring. Okay, so a nice match between a first principles and empirical model and new derived cosmogenic data. So it suggests that maybe we can disentangle some climate control, right? Well, maybe. The problem is there's a lot of site-specific insanity when we start getting this data together across different landscapes. Cliff Reevey out at Wyoming had done this in another location of the Sierras, and he compared chemical weathering rates with precipitation and temperature, and he basically found no relationship. Another researcher went to another area in the mountainous west, and he said, well, maybe annual temperature is the wrong metric. Let's actually talk about real soil temperatures. And so he put a bunch of temperature probes in these sites over like 3 years, thinking, wow, we'll really figure out the clear relationship now between regolith temperature and chemical weathering rates. And once again, no clear signal, right? So I think I found something in the Sierras, but there are a ton of other landscapes where this doesn't work. So what's going on? If climate is such a fundamental control of chemical weathering, why don't we see this? And I'll say there's a lot of people in the non-geomorphology community who see this and say, something must be wrong with the methods, because I know climate's important. But these metrics that are getting at the time scales of soil formation aren't telling us very much about the importance of climate. And so what we know, or what we suspect, is that, of course, the problem is we're going to these dynamic landscapes, the thing that motivated my talk in the first place, that you can't do this in a vacuum where you don't consider erosion or tectonic setting. And so this is a global compilation of all of the chemical weathering rates we have from cosmogenically derived measurements. Those are our red dots. And the global compilation of weathering from stream solutes in blue. And if you squint your eyes, you might notice that there's a relationship, a positive relationship. And I'll say you can do this same thing with climate variables, and you see nothing. And across each of these individual landscapes, there's often an incredibly strong relationship between the physical erosion rate and the chemical weathering rate. So we have erosion confounding these relationships in some way, where maybe climate explains some of the variation within this line, but it seems like physical erosion is really largely driving chemical weathering. And why would that be? Well, where you have chemical weathering, where you're dissolving rock, you're removing primary minerals, you're creating porosity, you're basically making material that's more easily eroded. And at the same time, where you have fast rates of physical erosion, you're constantly breaking up material, providing new surfaces for chemical weathering reactions. So there are lots of reasons to expect that these should be strongly correlated. We can go across the same compilation, instead of just thinking about chemical weathering rates, think about that chemical depletion fraction. So even if you don't remember the equation, what you can think about this is the fraction of mass loss occurring chemically in a dynamic landscape. So at a CDF of 80%, that means that erosion is only doing 20% of the work and chemical weathering is doing 80% of it. And so we find a really sharp threshold in terms of how chemically altered this material is. The other way to think about this is that in these soils, they've lost 80% of their mass from that original rock. So as we increase our denudation rate, we have a really rapid change in how chemically altered this material is and how much chemical weathering does. You can see this a little bit more clearly on the log-log plot, where we're plotting that chemical depletion versus total denudation rate. And in this plot, I've separated volcanic and non-volcanic terrain because they really weather in fundamentally different ways that's a bit beyond this talk. But what we see is that that rate of physical erosion, or that rate of total removal, is really strongly negatively correlated with how much work chemical weathering is doing.
How do you measure that x-axis?
The x-axis is from our cosmogenically derived denudation rate for the soils. For the rivers, it's a combination of the solute flux and the sediment flux. And we could imagine that this area all the way over to the left-hand side of the curve makes sense with the diagram we're looking at on the right of that Sri Lankan soil. We have really thick regolith, intensely weathered, and so there's just not that much left in the soil by the time that rock has been exhumed over a long time period up to the surface. Versus a rapid denudation rate area where you have fresh rock exposed at the surface, not very chemically altered, right? So there have been some lovely numerical models that help us to wrap our heads around what we might actually expect regarding physical erosion and chemical weathering. And there's a lot that goes into these models. They're actually based on the original bedrock lithology, the minerals that make up, the suite of minerals that make up those rocks, and the rates of dissolution of each of those minerals, how they're dependent on, what the dissolution rate of those minerals is. And then physical erosion rate on the x-axis is basically setting time. How long, if erosion is removing that surface of material, does a chunk of rock actually get to spend within the soil reactor? And so what a bunch of these models predict is a humped relationship between chemical weathering and physical erosion. And that decrease in chemical depletion, or that decrease in the extent of weathering of soils as that gray line. And so you can imagine a bunch of different weathering regimes from this. One, a supply limitation regime where basically physical erosion is setting chemical weathering because it's all completely weathered. All that soil needs in Sri Lanka is just a little bit more fresh rock to do its work, right? It has plenty of time, plenty of moisture, plenty of temperature to weather the system. It just needs the physical processes to bring new rock into the system. So that's, in that way, chemical weathering is set by the supply of fresh minerals, such as in Sri Lanka. We move into this environment where we're getting a nonlinear response of chemical weathering to physical erosion. So we're still getting the benefits of fresh mineral supply. Erosion rates are increasing, giving me lots and lots of yummy minerals. But I'm not having time to weather them completely. So some of them are just making it through the system out to the rivers, right? So we still get increases in chemical weathering, but it's kind of a relationship of diminishing returns, eventually leading to this fall off the system where we're completely dominated by the kinetics of chemical reactions, by the fact that erosion rates are so fast, we don't have time to weather these weatherable minerals. And this would be a system like what I showed here in the Alps. Okay, now one of the reasons this is a powerful image for thinking about climate is that climate can only have a direct impact on chemical weathering if the kinetics of chemical reactions are important, if that system is actually sensitive to changes in temperature or precipitation. So it's only in this blue regime that climate should directly influence chemical weathering. While in this red regime over here, oops, sorry, going backwards, there's not much room for climate to play a role because mineral supply is setting everything. Make Sri Lanka warmer and wetter and the soils aren't going to respond because all of the chemical weathering work has already been done. And so despite how this plot is shown, it seems from our limited data that most of the globe plots over here on the left-hand side. Remember that plot between weathering and chemical erosion or physical erosion rates? It was a positive relationship for the extent of data that we have across the globe now. So this is the world we live in, and this is the world we need to explore for chemical weathering and how it's influenced by climate. And that really only gives us a narrow range in which to look. And so what this means is that chemical weathering and that control of climate on chemical weathering is both elusive and elusive. It's completely elusive in that red regime because climate doesn't directly matter for chemical weathering. However, in the blue regime, it's elusive because we haven't been exploring landscapes that are sufficiently young in many cases to actually find this climate control on chemical weathering. And I say that with a caveat, and that's that geomorphologists haven't necessarily been doing it. That we're not finding the response we want in terms of total weathering rate and how it responds to climate. But there's abundant evidence from soils literature and biogeochemistry literature that shows that soil chemistry and soil texture is strongly influenced by climate. And so what's important here is that we're somewhat using different metrics. And the ones that I'm motivated with actually relate both to these geomorphic metrics and to those soil science and biogeochemistry metrics. And I show a plot here from a paper by one of my co-authors. I'm not on this, but it's looking at chemical weathering or soil chemistry variations across a large rainfall gradient in Hawaii. This is on a lava flow that's 150,000 years. And what he finds is that the saturation of base cations, things like calcium and magnesium, on exchange sites in soil, so basically how abundant these things are in terms of the capacity for this soil, strongly decreases with rainfall. So we have strong drops in available cations as we increase with rainfall. And this is shown in an incredibly old landscape, at least old from a geomorphic perspective, a system that's 150,000 years old. And I just suggested to you that the geomorphic perspective for the metrics we want to look at We need to go to really young landscapes. So we have a bit of a question here and a quandary regarding different approaches and different expectations for climate controls on chemical weathering. And so for the last part of this, I just want to tell you about one way that myself and co-authors are now thinking about how to address this nature of climate control on weathering processes. Trying to build on this multidiscipline insight, specifically targeting young soils for which we have limited data, and then moving across a strong climate gradient. And I'm going to go to the South Island of New Zealand for this. These are my 3 specific questions, and I'm running a little short on time, so I'm going to jump forward. New Zealand's amazing because you have an amazing orographic barrier that's built by the geology. You have this fault with extreme mountain building, very high topography, westerly winds that bring precipitation to the range and rapidly drop it off as they meet this orographic barrier, leading to a strong rainfall gradient from northwest to southeast across the system. And so we're going to zoom in on this little white square here to the Waitaki catchment, or the area of Lake Pukaki. If you've been to the South Island, you might have been to Mount Cook, which is just off the northern part of this slide. We go to moraines, soils developed in loess, wind-blown material that tops moraines. And we have a strong precipitation gradient across our site, crosses an order of magnitude change in precipitation. We have loess-derived soils that are on extremely well-mapped and well-dated moraines from cosmogenic beryllium 10 dating. And just to give you some context for this landscape, because pictures always speak 1,000 more words than just a figure, these are the moraines we're looking at, just on the side of Lake Pukaki. To give you some scale, this is how large they are. So really large LGM moraines in this system, and these are the loessl soils that cap these non-eroding surfaces, flat gradient surfaces at the very top. And so we move across about 30 soil profiles across this really large precipitation gradient, and we find strong variation in chemistry. So here I'm showing a plot of tau calcium on the y-axis versus that precipitation gradient on the x-axis. And I'm sure you don't quite remember the equation. Those of you who don't use these metrics, tau tells us the relative loss or gain of this element. So here a tau of negative 0.5 means that 50% of the calcium was lost from the original parent material. So these soils are basically 50% weathered with regards to calcium. And we see this for several different cations. I'm just putting up calcium and magnesium. So relative losses of these elements across the system. And we find strong changes in soil chemistry with precipitation that are repeated. And we see it both in the total loss of these elements from the soils, but we also find it in terms of the exchangeable elements. So while calcium is being dissolved from primary minerals, some of it is leaving to the soil solutes and streams, and some of it is being retained on exchange sites within the soil. You can imagine those things that are on exchange sites become the nutrients that are actually available to plants, available to the ecosystem. And so that's what we're looking at on the right-hand plot. We're looking at exchangeable potassium with precipitation, exchangeable magnesium, calcium. And what we can start to see in this data are sort of 2 different domains with regards to weathering, both in terms of total losses and in terms of those like plant available cations. A system where we have rapid decreases in the availability of these elements and in the abundance of these elements, and then a system where we've basically been depleted. We also see this in terms of phosphorus. So this is resin extracted phosphorus on the plot on the left-hand side. This is essentially plant available phosphorus. We find rapid declines in plant available phosphorus with precipitation. And as that phosphorus is being depleted, the limited phosphorus that we find is increasingly found at the surface. And so that's what the plot on the right-hand side is showing. It's basically the ratio of that surface value of phosphorus, the phosphorus found within the top 10 centimeters, compared to the phosphorus found within the entire profile. And so as we have decreases in available phosphorus, that phosphorus is increasingly found at the surface. That's a really strange thing from a weathering point of view, right? From an inorganic weathering point of view. But it's not surprising if you think about the biocycling of these elements. So while these nutrients are becoming increasingly depleted and unavailable to the ecosystems, these ecosystems become increasingly dependent on their ability to internally cycle them. And so we find phosphorus at the surface because that's where it's being deposited in litter and then being taken up again. So we find repeated thresholds in terms of cations and phosphorus, also in terms of the total losses of elements from these systems. And this is showing this sort of surface enrichment and biocycling. And so repeated thresholds, that's interesting. Young soil, that's interesting. But what does this actually mean for any of those things that I motivated this talk with? Why should you care about whether we have changes in element abundance with rainfall or changes in chemical weathering intensity with rainfall? Well, one thing that's important is that these thresholds that we find in soils that vary with climate they're not reversible. They're irreversible. And so think about the remaining cations in this soil. With my co-author Peter Vertusik, we're doing some numerical modeling of chemical weathering, reaction kinetics, and what this means for available nutrients to the ecosystem. And one interesting thing from this is that these pedogenic thresholds that I find in New Zealand are similar, but a little different than the ones we find in basalts in Hawaii. And so these are these New Zealand gray wacky derived materials. We find really sharp depletions in available cations across this rainfall gradient. This depletion is basically driven by available moisture for chemical weathering reactions. We might have a certain amount of precipitation, but we also have a large amount of evapotranspiration. And so somewhere below this threshold, we move to a positive water balance. And then basically at this threshold, that's where we have the available moisture to remove these elements in solution. So these are our New Zealand gray wackies. And then the Hawaii basalts do something a little different. And there are reasons to expect they might. Basalts tend to, those minerals almost weather away congruently. So all of the minerals are weatherable within basalts, while within these other gray wacky materials, only some of the minerals are weatherable. So you end up getting a lot more porosity. So there's some lithologic differences. That's interesting. But thinking about the influence of rainfall on chemical weathering actually tells us something really important about these thresholds, their nature, and how they may change under changing climates. And that's that here we have a simulated average rainfall. This is just taking a single rainfall and applying it to the system. But what happens if we increase storminess in this area while maintaining that same average rainfall? If we have a large threshold with regards to chemical weathering and climate, then we're actually going to see this threshold expressed at a completely different average rainfall, despite the fact that the average rainfall for these two systems is the exact same. So what we've done in this model is simply increase the stochastic nature of precipitation. So the one on the right-hand side is a system where we have constant rainfall at the same average. And the one on the left is where we've simply increased the variability of rainfall. And so what this means is that soils at much lower rainfall rates are completely depleted in these available cations and available phosphorus. Weathering rates appear completely different despite the fact of having the same average rainfall. And it's irreversible because changing the climate in this system, increasing the aridity or removing that moisture that's depleting these cations isn't going to reverse these effects because we've already lost them. So what's important is that we have these non-reversible thresholds That's really important for the biogeochemistry. We also have a nonlinear behavior. So remember, if we're below or above that threshold, we might not see any climate control on chemical weathering at all. So that means that if you don't cross that threshold precisely and you don't capture it with a high resolution, then you could completely miss or misinterpret the climate control on chemical weathering. The other thing is that the plots that I've ended with are much more nuanced than I would have liked to admit early in my career, when I just wanted to take zirconium and cosmogenics and say, what is weathering? Well, the truth is maybe our geomorphic perspective of weathering, or my original geomorphic perspective of weathering, where all that matters is how much is coming out, doesn't actually capture the importance of climate on these soils at all. So it's much more nuanced. And if you only care about total chemical weathering rates, maybe tectonics still trumps climate. I totally expect that. But if you care about biogeomorphic feedbacks, biogeochemistry, and why we should care about soil formation and why maybe that little girl will be excited about soil in 20 years, then these thresholds are crazy important. Lastly, this has important implications for people who use sediment cores to talk about past weathering systems. Because we can't just go and look at the elements within here and say, oh, we've had depletion of calcium that's steady. That must mean steady changes in rainfall. These thresholds, which are somewhat still poorly quantified, might suggest that you either turn weathering on or you turn it off with climate, which has important geomorphic, biogeomorphic feedback implications. And then lastly, if we're interested in how climate might control CO2, temperature might not matter that much, but moisture availability might be incredibly important. And once again, we're not just looking for a stepwise change in CO2 drawdown with changes in climate. It might once again be, boom, you cross this threshold and it's irreversible. So really important implications that haven't necessarily been explored yet for what this means for global climate on geologic timescales. And that's why, hopefully, all of you guys are excited now. I want to just end with a couple slides showing the arc of my research here at MSU. I'm still continuing on this New Zealand work with my colleagues at Stanford and USB. I want to highlight some work being done by my master's student, Sarah Benjamin, in the Bitterroot Basin. This is in collaboration with Andrew Wilcox at University of Montana, where we're looking at how climate and topography might influence both soil formation, sediment movement, but also the connection between hill slopes and channels. I'm doing work with Rachel Jensen, my other master's student. This is with help from Kathy Whitlock, who's kindly giving us access to some of her sediment cores that provide really strong paleo-environmental proxies for changes over the Holocene. This isn't actually one of the sediment cores. This is an image from James Bennis's work. But this is relying on this meteoric beryllium-10 atom, which I didn't talk very much. The thing that I basically suggested might be trash, but it isn't. It's incredibly important. And it might be a really powerful paleo-precipitation and paleo-erosion proxy. Lastly, I have a group of undergrads, some of whom are in this room, who are doing really fabulous work across a bunch of different questions. And then I want to highlight some of the lab facilities I'm building here at MSU, both a cosmogenic isotope prep lab to do this beryllium-10 work, and then also I'll be consumed next week with getting my fallout radionuclide lab set up, which is a gamma spectroscopy. I have 2 gamma spectroscopy machines where we'll be able to measure of these fallout radionuclides like cesium-137 and lead-210 and beryllium-7, which also nicely trace sediment movement over much shorter time periods. Okay, and thank you guys very much. I'm sorry I went late.
These rocks are gradually rising up, no, because everything else is washing away. And you've got a rate at which they're moving based on the beryllium. Mm-hmm. And that and your estimates of what the rate is on average over time. Is there anything that could happen that would make that rate be variable, like tree rings? Climate's a possibility. Are there others?
No, absolutely. I mean, go to this previously glaciated environment, and the rate of that mineral exhumation is likely dramatically changed over time. And, you know, these cosmogenic nuclides are integrating over that. You don't have to assume that it's been a constant rate for those equations, so that's often misunderstood. You can put in these changing rates. You can assume that you're completely out of steady state. Even in Sri Lanka, I have almost no reason to suggest that over the million years that that regolith has been formed, that the rate of regolith formation is constant. But it's still, these mass balance techniques and this cosmogenic technique still give me a meaningful integrated rate that over that time, that's how much work was done, even if I don't quite know how stochastically it occurred. And this is one reason that the meteoric beryllium-10 might be really valuable, because you can look at changes in erosion history and climate history throughout a sediment core, maybe. Jim?
On your little thing with the single grain moving up.
Oh, yeah.
We imagine it's a silt grain, and let's imagine it's feldspar, so it's reactive. I would argue that if you could watch that over time scales of 10 to the 0 to 10 to the 3 years, okay, watch it constantly, which we can never do, that grain spends the majority of its time physically being impacted by bioturbation, mostly by earthworms, and it spends most of its chemical time in the gut of earthworms. And so the chemistry that it is exposed to is mostly controlled mostly by the gut microbiome of earthworms rather than the chemistry of the water that flows through it. And we already know that earthworms sequester carbon dioxide through precipitation of calcium carbonate in their feces. And so maybe going out and measuring ions flowing through soil is totally wrong to do. And also knowing that earthworms in North America today are an introduced species,
Right.
part of the Great Columbian Exchange, that maybe looking at those processes happening today is not necessarily reflective of what's happening 1,000 years ago.
So I'm actually going to disagree with you. And that's mainly I'm going to disagree with you over the period of time that that mineral spends in these different layers. So, for example, in that Sri Lanka system, where I showed this thin soil and this really thick saprolite, the actual chemistry of the soil and saprolite are almost indistinct, because all of the chemical weathering reaction happened within this tiny little weathering front 30 meters deep when bedrock was converted to saprolite. Now, I'm not saying that's not microbially mediated. I'm not saying the acidity didn't come from the biota above and maybe in the middle, but it's a really rapid change in chemical weathering within these regolith profiles. And most of it happens way deeper than you'd ever think. Now, go to a system like the Alps, and you might find a stronger gradient in chemistry. And there you might find small changes in saprolite chemistry as you move from rock to the upper surface of saprolite, and then you enter soil, and boom, it's a completely different beast. It's completely depleted. And in that system, in these young systems, I think biology has a much more important role.
It would seem that relative topographic position is really important. You sort of mentioned that, but this all seems to be in a very high gradient kind of environment. If you think about it in terms of a lower topographic position, there would seem to be some different things going on.
Absolutely. I will say that the New Zealand data is actually in what we assume to be non-eroding systems. And I didn't present it, but I have soil residence times from meteoric beryllium-10 there. You're right, we're going pretty high up in these systems because we want to be on convex slopes, things that look like this that we understand. When you get down to something like this, for me, as a geomorphologist, I start to freak out because there are a lot other things happening. It's a depositional environment. It's sometimes depositional. The techniques I use don't lend themselves well to that. You also have water and the flow path of water that is changing how those fluids are in equilibrium with the soil. And there's some really fabulous people who are looking at those systems. One of the things that I do globally is I'm really interested in how much chemical weathering is happening in floodplains where you already have pretty depleted sediment. But you're right, what I've mostly presented are upland landscapes, these soils that fit my limited conceptual model of the world.
One last question. Okay, well, great.
Thank you.